Michael, a middle-aged professional travel writer working for the New York Times, arrives in Israel, predisposed to immerse himself in everything this country will offer. Experiencing the seemingly raw, coarse culture and information structure for the first time, he finds the place that was rented in advance. Before knocking on the door, he hears a loud conversation inside and, troubled by this, talks to a young man who opens the door. The youngster's name is Tomer, and he is the owner of this apartment. He argues that the place isn't booked for today, but after the proper documentation is shown to him, a light switch is turned on inside his brain, and he realizes that time went too fast. Regretting the mistake, he invites the middle-aged man inside and assures him that he will make the apartment look as good as new in no time. As it seems, he's been doing some shooting for his class for the entire night. Though sleepless, he moves around energetically while Michael is looking around, feeling a kind of pity for the young man. He tells him that it isn't necessary. He will find a hotel and stay there. Tomer puts in all of his efforts to make him stay. Finally, when all other arguments are put forward, he honestly says that he really needs the money. It would seem inhuman on Michael's part to reject him now. Trying to settle himself in, he reorganizes some stuff without complaining about anything. He sees how the young man is struggling. It is clear that he is a wholehearted, honest person who just forgot what date it is. Now, his plans are shattered, and he has to pick up the pieces himself. Looking at him from the balcony, Michael smiles with empathy at his efforts to compensate for lost time. The apartment isn't that important to the travel writer. He spends the following afternoon in the streets of Tel Aviv, experiencing the unfamiliar world. Reflecting on his experience, Michael tries to figure this culture out until getting back to the apartment. He receives a video call from his husband, named David. From the conversation between them, we find out that Michael has been having trouble sleeping for a very long time. The pills that were prescribed to him don't really work. The writer shows David around the apartment, pointing out that the owner is probably a film student. Noticing the pictures of Tomer on the walls, David expresses half-jokingly just how attractive he looks. Michael doesn't attune to his mood, though, and the conversation is soon finished in a lovely tone. Michael finds himself observing the picture more closely now. Tomer seems to be engaged in an adventurous kind of life. In silence, the writer goes to bed and struggles to fall asleep as always. Next morning, the sleepless Michael visits the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. While observing a reactionary political poster by David Tarkover, he receives a call from a hospital. The lady on the other side informs him happily that they found a surrogate mother for him, and David and the girl are ready to meet them. From the expression on Michael's face, we understand that David probably contacted the hospital behind his back. The arrangements were, for some reason, made without Michael's participation. This is a wonderful, but a huge step, and the writer reflects on how he should react to it within the course of the next scenes. We see his behavior toward Tomer change in the next scene. He is sitting on the balcony when the young man appears downstairs. He is saying goodbye to his friend, and from the way he speaks, and from the content of their exchange, Michael gets the idea that the youngster might be gay too. Before opening the door to him, he checks himself out in the mirror. Tomer comes in, saying that he just has to pick some of his stuff up and be out of his hair right away. But Michael offers him to stay over for breakfast. It is a sunny, peaceful morning, and the two eat their food on the balcony, making conversation as they go forward. Michael tells him about his occupation and his column called The Intrepid Writer in the New York Times. The name of the column is an overgeneralization. Of course, he only tries to be intrepid in the face of new adventures and life's difficulties. How he manages that is another subject. His plan is to show Tel Aviv as it really is, and he has a special plan for that. When Tomer is shown a list of places the writer wants to visit, he rolls his eyes and assures him that he has chosen the most cliché places to observe. In the next scene, the two leave the apartment building together. As it seems, Tomer wants to show him some of the places that are really reflective of his culture. But the first thing he notices is that his bicycle has been stolen. Set afire by this outrageous thing, he heads over to one of the bike shops, thinking that the thieves took it there to sell it. His hypothesis turns out to be true. Entering the shop, he notices his bike and tries to retrieve it, but the seller gets in his way. He asks for money for it, and after a few minutes of squabbling, Tomer gives up. As he explains afterwards, there is no point in calling the police in this area. He knows the owner's son, so he will probably be able to get his bike back somehow. The rage slowly dissipates as he gets some pomegranate juice and walks through the colorful bazaars of Tel Aviv, together with Tomer. After a couple of hours, they eat dinner at a local restaurant and share some of the more intimate details of their lives. As it seems, Michael hasn't always been a journalist. Once, he wanted to be a fictional writer. In the early 90s, he even wrote a book about the terrible events that occurred both in New York's history and in his life. Tomer doesn't understand so far that he's touching on a very painful part of Michael's personality. So he asks some deeper questions, until Michael is forced to say that his boyfriend passed away from AIDS before he wrote that book. The tone of the conversation has changed dramatically here. To change the subject, Michael shifts the focus to Tomer and asks him about his occupation. As the young man says, he wants to create movies that touch people. Talking enthusiastically and vaguely, He points out the characteristics that every good film should have. None of them get bored throughout the day. That night, Michael learns that the young man doesn't have a place to stay, so he offers to crash on the couch in his apartment. In exchange, he could continue giving him tours. Tomer is extremely reluctant, but soon the writer manages to convince him. Both immerse themselves in their own lines of work, until Tomer shows Michael some of his work. It is an art horror aimed at creating some strong bodily sensations in viewers. It is well made, but Michael finds himself searching for words afterwards. He wants to give out his evaluation, but all that comes to his mind is that it's interesting. Tomer is frustrated by this. His view of cinema is clearly different from Michael's, who prefers to watch light musicals over vague and ambiguous horror movies. Suddenly, there is a knock on the door. To Michael's surprise, it is the girl who played Tom in Tomer's film. She's his best friend, and her name is Daria. As it seems, she just had a fight with her boyfriend. She's a dancer, and her boyfriend is her dancing partner, who seems to have insulted her during one of their rehearsals. If you ask Tomer, it is nothing serious. Daria and her boyfriend break up and make up all the time. It's customary in their relationship. Daria is extremely upset. However, as she says now, it is definitely over between her and Amir. Here, Michael learns that the show is tomorrow, and he is invited to come. He is also invited to smoke, but he rejects it immediately. As the night progresses, Daria expresses that she finds it almost impossible to be an artist here, especially the one who creates art together with her Palestinian boyfriend. This is why she is planning on leaving Israel after this show. Michael hates to play the role of a middle-aged friend here, but he still pitches in some of his experience. When he was a young man, he would always fight and protest and get arrested. Perhaps the young people of Israel should do the same. The response to this is simple. To Daria, leaving Israel is part of her protest. This day proves to have been very productive for the writer. Even though he should be tired by now, he fails to sleep in his bed again. Coming out of the living room, he sees the youngsters sleeping on the couch with no pajamas and moves over towards the bathroom. He drinks more sleeping pills and observes himself in the mirror. After spending time with young people, he notices the passage of time on his face much more clearly. On day 3, Michael finds Tomer on a beach. The young man seems to have found a book of his own in a local bookshop. Unexpectedly, a man comes up to them and asks Tomer why he didn't text him last night. Clearly, the two have some sort of close relationship, and when the man leaves, Michael asks Tomer about it. As the young man sees it, he doesn't like to label any relationship. He is all for an unshackled, free way of living, both in professional and private lives. A conversation starts out now, in which the fact is pointed out that Michael has a relationship, which is completely opposite of what Tomer views as desirable. The old man says that it is normal. As relationships evolve, certain things change. The youngster, however, doesn't even want to think about the relationship in which closeness and intimacy are absent. From a guy who favors irresponsible, polygamous sex, this statement sounds quite paradoxical. Michael seems to be in a great mood after the conversation. He looks around the beach, smiling, but suddenly notices a kid going into the sea all alone, crying his heart out, jumping up. Michael runs toward him and picks him up. Right away, the mother of this child approaches and scolds the foreigner for being such a creep. Clearly, there are some cultural differences underlying this misunderstanding. That night, Michael is reading a book when he receives a call from David. The latter apologizes for not letting him know about the enormous step that he took towards having a baby, as much as he realizes it was a mistake. He's still excited to follow through with the process. He assures his husband that he had no ill intention and that Suzanne, the surrogate mother, really sounds amazing. From his perspective, their relationship will become much richer after this gigantic step is taken. Michael, on the other hand, is still furious with David. As it seems, he has never wanted to have a child as much as David wanted it. Now, he expresses it harshly and unanimously. He wants to drop this entire matter for good. He doesn't want to have a kid, and David shouldn't even try to make him reconsider. The dance show is about to start soon, so he cuts the conversation short and leaves his partner speechless. Amir and Daria's dance show is an example of a contemporary, daring form of art that endeavors to push boundaries. A wide variety of emotions are expressed, as the meaning remains open to interpretation. It is tough to determine how Michael feels while watching it. Confusion and awe take turns in his expressions. He attends the after-party too, but leaves much too early. He takes a shower in the next scene, and coming out into the living room, he finds that Tomer is already home, scrolling through Atraf, which is the Israeli equivalent of Grindr. Michael gets extremely interested and amused by this. Looking over at Tomer's phone, he compliments one of the guy's bodies and regrets it immediately, because Tomer quickly invites him over. Taken aback by how easy it is to order sex, Michael sees that the guy really comes over after a few minutes. The name of the young man is Kobai, and he seems to be quite unpleasantly surprised by the presence of a middle-aged man in his pajamas. Still, he makes conversation with a smile on his face, until Tomer takes a seat with them and begins the very brief process of seduction. Kobai is a little reluctant at first, since he's confused about Michael's role, but passion takes his mind off of it quickly. The writer watches them for a while. Perhaps he even wants to join them, but very soon he feels too uncomfortable, stands up, and disappears to his room. Falling asleep is going to be that much more difficult for him now. Tomer feels bad the next morning. He goes over to Michael's room and finds out that he's no longer there. Strolling around the streets, he runs into him nearby. The writer is waiting for a taxi, thinking that it will be best if he spends the last night in Tel Aviv alone. Besides, he really needs to work. Tomer puts all his efforts into making him reconsider. He says that his mother has invited Michael over for dinner, and she will murder her son if he comes alone. The writer is convinced. The train ride is quiet, as is the area in which Tomer's mother resides. The young man points to the places that hold special value to him, until both enter his mother's house. Her name is Malka, and she welcomes the guest with open arms. She apologizes for being so unprepared. Her son told her only in the last minute that Michael was coming too. The writer smiles after hearing this. He realizes that he's been fooled. Still, he's in a wonderful mood during the dinner that evening. The food is extremely delicious, and he finds himself sharing his thoughts about Tel Aviv with a brightened face. He points out that it is full of contradictions, but in his eyes, the contrasting themes create a sort of orderly chaos in this city. He expresses much gratitude towards Tomer too, emphasizing that seeing the culture through his eyes helped him a lot. The mother points out now that her son must be feeling the same warmth towards him as well. He never brings anyone here, and the fact that he brought Michael means that he holds great value in his eyes. The conversation takes an extremely sharp turn then. Over a period of a few seconds, it becomes gloomy and depressive. It all starts when Malka asks Michael if he has any kids. The writer expresses his opinions about having children, and then, for a while, the woman tries to lure him into being convinced that having children is better than not having them. Nothing changes for a few minutes as Milka's sentences become more and more rigorous. Naturally, she only means well, not realizing that she might be touching on some dark, painful themes for Michael. To put an end to this line of conversation, the writer then admits why he doesn't want to have a child. As it seems, it's been only a few months since a tragic thing happened in his and his partner's lives. Michael remembers that they had a perfect surrogate and a perfectly healthy child. They made it to the delivery room. But unfortunately, the kid didn't make it. The dream of becoming a father was shattered for Michael, who got nothing but a hostile, resentful gaze from his own dad after this tragedy. It is clear now why he has no intention of thinking about trying it again. Here, Tomer's entire perspective on Michael is changed. For the first time, he sees it in full focus how painful life has been to the writer. Michael apologizes for telling this story, feeling a powerful wave of emotion rise inside of him. He laughs nervously and adds that they were going to name the child Sarah, after his late mother, even though this subject is clearly hurting him. He seems unbent in the face of life's worst tragedies. Tomer clearly seems to admire him for this. He reads Michael's book on the train as the writer finally manages to fall asleep. In the next scene, the pajamas are put on, and the clothes are neatly folded as Michael prepares for the next day's departure. Feeling particularly energetic, he even sorts out Tomer's entire wardrobe. The young man is extremely surprised to see his things so perfectly arranged. Here, for the first time, he learns how to fold and store his socks. It is an oddly intimate moment between the two, as Michael explains how to make a perfect square out of two socks. A tender bond is formed between them, resonating with home-like warmth. After the process, there are only two single socks that are left pairless. They are like two lost humans, completely different from one another. Craving a soulmate, Tomer puts it in his hand, and Michael does the same. Together, they play out a scene in which they come together and make a pact to leave loneliness behind. Failing to find a perfect partner, the right piece that is missing, they decide to merge and make this moment of unusual intimacy count. Michael stands still, reflecting on his feelings and closing his eyes as Tomer kisses him gently. The writer neither does nor resists anything. He simply lets the experience happen and run through his entire organism. This is the way his last night in Tel Aviv goes in bed with Tomer. He wakes up to see a sunny, wonderful morning in the next scene. The chopping noises coming from the kitchen tell the writer that the young man is probably preparing breakfast. It will be a tough thing to leave this city, especially after what happened last night, and the food that is waiting for him outside his room will definitely make it much more difficult. It all seems extremely delicious. Over the table, they speak about ordinary things in the sun, until Michael expresses his will to call his father once he's back in New York. His old man seems to be from Israel, and he will most likely be delighted to hear that his son went back to his roots. A fight of broken bread pieces breaks off between the two, and the cheerful attitude continues to dominate the space as they make their way towards the airport. The atmosphere seems to be loose at first, until a realization that the inevitable farewell is coming hits them both at the same time. They both look outside and dive deep into their thoughts. Arriving at the airport, they engage in yet another cheerful conversation, touching on some surface feelings and plans. After avoiding thinking about Michael's departure, The couple discusses their plans. Tomer feels that only a few minutes are left. However, he changes the subject abruptly and urges Michael to try having kids again. It isn't too late to give life one more chance. The writer smiles in surprise, seeing this enormous shift in Tomer's personality. He points out that 5 days earlier, the young man was rooting for the idea that life can have a happy ending. Tomer explains, however, that it has nothing to do with a happy ending. It's just that, in his eyes, Michael will make a wonderful father. The writer is extremely pleased by these words. Noticing the strong evidence for honesty in Tomer's expression, he smiles and stands up to say a quick goodbye. After hugging him dearly, he begins breaking away, but finds that the young man is gripping him more and more strenuously. Soon, he hears Tomer cry as the mask of emotional rigidity is torn off his face. Michael doesn't know exactly how to react. He tries to assure him that everything is okay, and the young man soon manages to recollect himself slowly. He urges the writer to go then, and watches as Michael decides not to make the process of saying goodbye any more difficult. The first thing he does on the plane is call David to let him know that he's coming back. Meanwhile, Tomer gets his bike back and cycles away. Having undergone a strange change within the course of the last week, both characters seem ready to meet life again.